Hi guys, Anthony Turnham here, and in this architectural photography editing video, we'll be taking a look at how we can turn this photograph of the Science Museum in Valencia into this using Lightroom, and then we'll finish things off with a sky swap and just adding a little bit more punch to the image using Luminar as a plugin. But before we get into that, if architectural photography, real estate photography, editing those kind of photos is your thing, please go ahead and subscribe to my new architectural photography specific channel, which I'm going to link to in the description below. Go there because that's where I'm going to be sharing all of this kind of content going forward. Yes, I'm still sharing this kind of content for now, but I'm just wanting to let you guys know if that's your thing, I've set up that dedicated channel. That's it for now. Let's get into the editing. How do you start building an architectural photography portfolio when you don't have an existing client base? That's a question that I get asked an awful lot, and to be honest, it's not actually as hard as you might think, as hopefully I'll demonstrate in this video. This amazing bit of architecture is the Science Museum in Valencia, Spain, and I took this while I was traveling, and that's what I would strongly recommend that you do, is just keep your eye out when you're in new locations or just wandering around the city where you live, and just photograph architecture that interests you. From there you can bring your work into Lightroom, Photoshop, Luminar, whatever, do your editing and start to build a really powerful portfolio. Now in this one what we're going to do is edit this shot, which is not particularly great, into something a little bit more impactful here in Lightroom, and then we'll just finish it off with a little bit of a helping hand from a plugin. So let's jump back to our original file, which really isn't the best representation of this amazing architecture, but we're going to see what we can do inside of Lightroom to improve things. So first of all, I want to come into the basic panel and move away from the profile, which is set to Adobe color, and I want to go for the camera neutral profile. And I always find that's a really great place to start with architecture. I know it's a very flat looking profile, but that's going to enable us to build our own contrast into the file. For the most part with my editing in Lightroom, what I like to do is work top down and work globally and get my adjustments looking pretty good. And then I'll do quite a lot of work with the local masking feature as well. So first things first, let's set a neutral color balance. Clicking on an area that's white like here should give us a helping hand, but we don't just have to settle for the first place we click. We can actually change the area that we want to click on and just get a different look. And as you can see, as I click on different areas that are all supposedly part of the same tonal range, that white going through here, we're getting very different results depending where we click, which tells us one thing: the lighting coming from the different sources in this photo is just all over the place. And so there's not really going to be a correct white balance as such. It's more going to be up to us to choose a color balance that we think is appealing to our eye. So I'm going to go for something like this. Now the next thing I like to do is do a little bit of what I call a file test, and that is grabbing the exposure slider and just dropping it all the way down to the left and just looking at the highlights and exploring, okay, how far can I push this file? Where am I losing detail? And currently we can see that this area of lighting here has no information in those highlights whatsoever, and we're also blowing out in these lights here. And that's why normally if I was doing a professional shoot, I would be shooting several bracketed shots, so that I had all the information I needed for the highlights and the shadows as well. But in this case, look, we're going to be able to do a pretty good edit just based on what we've got, but we just need to be mindful of the limits of this file. I'm going to leave the contrast alone for now, and I'm just going to start playing with the highlights and bring those to a point that I feel it's looking better in the file, grab the shadows and just have a play with those as well. And at this point during my processing, I'm just trying to make sure that I have a good dynamic range in the file to work with. I'm keeping an eye on my histogram here as I'm moving my blacks and white points, just to make sure that our information of tonality starts at the bottom left of the histogram and that we're not really blowing out too much on the right hand side. I don't mind this little bit of a peak here because obviously that's going to represent this area here, but the rest of the information stretches throughout that histogram. From here we can move on into the present section, and the texture slider is one that I'm not really a big fan of. I find that localized contrast is often just a little bit too heavy-handed. So I'll reset our before and look at our after, and for sure it's adding some detail, but I don't want to do that at this part of the process if at all. but I do like the clarity slider, and if I start moving that up to the right, you can see that I can be quite aggressive with this. Like 100% is too much, but bear in mind, if you were to do this with a portrait or another genre of photography, things would look pretty awful that high. And sure, they don't look great here either, but we can get away with pushing the clarity slider much higher on architecture than we can on other genres of photography. But what I like to do is actually just ease in a little bit of clarity on the photo overall, and then I can come in and reapply a stronger pass of clarity just over the architecture itself. Just for now, I'm just going to press T on my keyboard to get rid of the toolbar, and I'm just going to get rid of that thumbnail strip as well, just to give us a little bit more screen real estate. Before we start looking at vibrance and saturation, I just want to visually look at my photo and assess the colours. And what we've got going on here is a lot of light pollution in the clouds. They're getting a very orangey tinge, and I'm really not enjoying that. I don't think that's a particularly nice aesthetic for this overall photo. I feel that rather than complementing the orange and blue, I feel like that's clashing with the scheme that we've got going on at the moment. So I definitely want to minimize the oranges up here, and I'm also mindful of the colored lights we've got going on here along the fins on the side of the building, because they are already very saturated in that blue. But with that in mind, I'm going to grab the vibrance slider and just push it up and see what it does. There's no harm in grabbing these sliders and just getting a feel for what's going on. The same for the saturation. I'm going to push that pretty high and see what's going on. I quite like the look that we're getting in the water down here, this nice rich aqua colour we've going on, but the kind of yellow colour staining we've got going on here, and again that orange and pink in the clouds, that's not looking good. So I'm just going to be mindful of that and bring that saturation just down somewhere around there. Currently I'm quite happy with the contrast that's in the file, so I'm going to leave the tone curve alone for now, but I'm going to carry on with my exploration of the colour just by jumping into this section here, and I'm going to show all of the options for the colours here and just start playing around. I'm going to pull out some of that orange saturation, some of the red, and there's probably some of that colour existing in that magenta. That purple is actually talking into this light on the side of the building here, so I'm just going to ease this back just a little bit, maybe push it more towards those blue hues, just so we have a little bit more colour harmony going on there. From here I'm going to move on. I don't need to worry about any colour grading at the moment, so I'm going to jump straight into the detail section, and I like to zoom in here. We're currently at 100%, and I'm just going to apply some pretty strong sharpening. Push the radius up. Now I'm at ISO 200 here. Normally I shoot my architecture at ISO 64, but because it was getting dark, this was a long exposure, 6 seconds, I wanted to try and cover this building from lots of different angles while I was there. Only one opportunity to do this, so I set my ISO higher than I normally would so that I could reduce the amount of time that I was actually exposing for each shot. But the consequence of that is obviously I've started to introduce more noise that obviously when we start bringing the sharpening and mount up, we're going to see more of that noise. So I'm happy to be quite strong, quite heavy-handed, if you will, with the sharpening on the actual architecture itself. But you can see that it's making lots of jaggedy noise in the sky there. So one way to fix that would obviously be to grab the noise reduction slider and start pushing that up. Or the alternative would be to use the sharpening mask, bring the noise reduction back down, and just play with this slider here. And a good way to see what you're doing with the sharpening sliders is just to hold the Alt key option on a Mac while you're actually moving these, and you can see exactly what's going on. So as I move this to the right, you can see that the sharpening effect is now only going to be applied to the white areas, which currently is just sat on the areas of information, the hard lines of the building, and I'd got rid of that completely from the sky, or pretty much completely gone from the sky. So any sharpening that we're applying from 0 all the way to 150, now that is only being applied to the edges of the building. Sometimes I find if I'm pushing this masking effect too strongly to the right, the transition between where it is masking and where it isn't is just a little bit too aggressive. And so what I like to do is kind of split the difference and just ease it off a little bit, and then just counter that with a little bit of noise reduction. It's kind of the best of both worlds. And if we want to see what we've done there, we can just toggle that effect off and on and just check that we're happy with it, which I am. Now the next thing that I'll do is come into my lens correction, and normally this is one of the first things that is done to any of my photos, and it's done normally with an initial preset on import. But first thing, remove chromatic aberration, and absolutely for architecture we want to enable profile correction, and what that's going to do is get rid of any distortion that we might have in the lens, and also any darkening around the corners, that vignetting effect that we can get. If you like the idea of correcting the geometry of the lens but you want to leave the vignetting on, you can always just grab that vignetting slider and just take that back down. But often I'll just leave a little bit of that vignetting in because I like a natural darkening towards the edges of my frame. Now another really important part of architectural photography and making sure it looks good in Lightroom or any other editor is to make sure that at the very least your verticals are vertical and parallel. And so in the transform dialog box here, there are various ways that we can tackle this. We've got these sliders here that we can actually address the vertical orientation of the photo. You can also work with the horizontal. We can rotate it to make sure that our horizon line is nice and straight. However, the best way that I've found nowadays is to actually use the guided approach, and by doing that we're able to draw two lines, and they're going to represent the verticals of the frame. So that's the first one, and that shows a tilt in towards the top of the frame, and that's quite common when you're framing your photos without a tilt shift lens. And then if we do the same over the other side and just are respectful of what should be parallel over there, all of a sudden we get that popping effect of the photo just being corrected for us. Beyond that, we could also draw a line to represent the horizon line, so we can draw one across there and just make sure that that's nice and straight as well. From here, before I move on to the local adjustments, there's just one more thing that I would like to do, and that is to apply a crop to this photo. It doesn't have a particularly dynamic framing to this photo, and in particular one thing that's bothering me is this area here where there was a bit of repair work going on to this part of the building, and so it's not really doing any favours for the overall photo. And so as much as I would love to leave this in as a more balanced composition, I'm actually going to create a tighter crop just so that we can lose that repair work over there. Guys, if you're enjoying this architectural photography editing video and you want to learn more about that particular subject, please go ahead and subscribe to my new channel, which I'll link to in the description below, because it is all about architectural photography, and that's where I'll be sharing all this good stuff going forward. But if you want to watch it here on my normal channel, that's absolutely fine. I just won't be sharing much more of this kind of content here. And I'm going to leave this with a composition so that the base of the building is sat approximately on a third line here, and this little shadow line that we've got across the water, that starts in the bottom right. So overall I'm pretty happy with that crop. Double click to apply it. And now it's time to start working on those local adjustments. And so one of the big issues that I have with this photo is the sky and the coloration or discoloration of the clouds. I really don't like that. And so we can now use the select sky feature inside of Lightroom, which is a relatively new feature. And that lets some clever AI inside of Lightroom try and detect where the sky is. Now, while it is a good time saver, it's not as accurate as some tools like you might find inside of, say, Luminar AI, for example. But it's certainly quicker than trying to do this manually, and then we can refine things further if we want. So now I've got the sky selected. What I want to do is just speak into those clouds and just see if I can actually dull down some of this orange tonality. And a quick way to give that a helping hand would just be to grab the temperature slider and push that more towards the blues. And if we ignore the very left of the frame, already things are looking much better. And in spite of the colour as well, the clouds aren't particularly visually pleasing. And so one thing you can do just to soften the clouds is grab the clarity slider and just take that into the negative territory. While we're talking about clarity, let's do what I alluded to earlier, which is focusing the clarity just on the architecture itself. So that's pretty easy to do. All we need to do is create a new mask. And I really like using the radial mask because that allows us just to click in the center of the architecture and draw out an oval which roughly covers the structure that we're dealing with. I like to set my feathering nice and high so then transition from the very strongest effect right in the middle towards the edge where it disappears into nothingness. That just eases off nicely. So now we have our rough radial gradient applied. I can grab the clarity slider and start making adjustments. And now I've been able to boost that clarity really aggressively and give some really interesting crunchy detail to all this lovely architecture, while at the same time leaving the water and the sky alone. Because we are pretty much talking just into the architecture at the moment, we could make further refinements if we want to. And if we want to check we're happy with the effect, we come up to the eye tool, click that so we can see our before and our after, before and after. And if we think we may have pushed things just a little bit too far, what you can do is come over to this little arrow up here in the top right. If you click that, now we get this magical amount slider, and I can grab that and just ease that back. So basically we can say, I want none of the effect, I want 100% of the effect, or somewhere in between. So we could go for 2/3 of the effect, 66%, there we go. Another thing that I like to do with Lightroom's local masking is to really try and draw our attention to the architecture itself. And one way to do that is by darkening down the foreground, sometimes darkening down the sky, and that can create the illusion of a brighter building. So what I'm going to do is create another new mask. This time I'm going to use a linear gradient, because that's going to allow, I said radiant, I meant gradient. That's going to allow us to pull from the bottom up towards this, and so we can have 100% of the effect at the bottom, feathering out to none as we transition up. And from here, I need to access those controls again. So this time what I need to do is just press the arrow to see all of my controls for this gradient I've just created. And now what I can do is just bring the exposure down and play with the contrast. And if I want to, I can just push a little bit more blue into the water as well. And while I do like that, I feel it's getting a little bit too much of an electric blue kind of look. So while I like the hue, I'll leave that. I'm just going to bring the saturation of it just down a little bit. And again, come up to the eyeball tool and look at our before and our after. And it's got rid of all of that yellow kind of tinging that we had going on in the water. This was our before, this was our after, and again our eye is now drawn more forcefully towards that architecture, which is exactly what we want. Often I'll keep refining my image by adding more and more masks until I'm happy with the final result, but you get the idea. I'm going to leave that there. The final step that I'm going to do, which is what I'd recommend to any of you who want to take your architecture or any photo editing to the next level, and that is to leverage the power of plugins. Don't just rely on what Adobe offers you, say inside of Lightroom. So for this one, I'm going to right click, come down to edit in, and you can see that I have a lot of plugins at my disposal. I'm a big fan of plugins, and the one that I'm going to go to that I use an awful lot for my architecture editing in particular is Luminar AI. And I'm just going to edit a copy with all of those Lightroom adjustments that we've just applied. And absolutely, I want to work with a high quality TIFF with a bit depth of 16 and the color space of Adobe RGB. I'm happy with that, a nice deep color space, and we just click edit. And that's going to load Luminar AI as a plugin where we can do a one-off edit on this photo. Now, I actually have a lot of templates that I've already created specifically for my architecture. So just with one click, my photos can get that helping hand. So here's our before, here's our after. You know, it's a nice little improvement from a pretty good image to one that has a lot more impact, just like that. But that's not very informative for you guys, so I'm just going to reset that by coming down here, reset adjustments, and I'm going to build a little bit of an edit for us. And you guys can see just how useful this tool is. So Accent AI, that is a really great tool inside of Luminar AI that basically looks at your photo, adds local contrast, global contrast, and improves the color saturation as well. It's really nice. So if I just look at this before and after, it's subtle, but it's a nice improvement. Structure AI is really useful as well. Never at 100%, you know, that's way too much, but it's a good idea to see what the tool does, and then you can come in and just kind of refine what you want. So let's say we want to put 25% of it in, but not over the whole image, just over the architecture. That's what we want people to look at. So I can just roughly paint that over the architecture, and then we can look at our before and our after. We're heading in the right direction. And if you've got areas in your image you're not happy with, such as this little crane that's poking out of the top of the building here, we can use Luminar's very clever erase tool. Just click the erase feature, paint over it, and come up and click erase. Luminar's going to do a little calculation for us, and just like that, it's gone. But one of the main reasons that I wanted to bring this into Luminar is because I really like the sky replacement feature. It's so good for architecture. And as we were able to see what Lightroom could do earlier, we can have a direct comparison. So if I come into the sky selection here, and if you're serious about architecture, I would recommend you get a really good sky library. I've got a link to one in the description below if you are interested. But I'm going to come into the night section, which is from that library. And I'm just going to choose one of these at random to sit behind the building. Let's go for this one. And if you recall, Lightroom struggled to mask out this area here and recognize that that was part of the sky. But as you can see, Luminar's done a fantastic job of recognizing exactly where that is. This sky is not one that I want to use. I thought it might be, but I'm not happy with that. So let's just select a different one and see how that looks. Okay, I'm much happier with that. That's the 26th photo in the night section of that sky library that I mentioned before. I could keep going through selecting different ones to see if there's one I prefer, but for the sake of speed in this video, I'm going to stick with this one, but I'm going to see if I can get it to better sit within the scene. And we've got a whole heap of options to help us refine the look of the sky, but one thing that I think I would like to do is just change the warmth of the sky and push it more into the blue hues, just to try and get rid of some of this purple up here. And because of how dark the clouds are just here, I feel like we're losing a little bit of definition between the sky and the roof of our building. So I'm just going to grab the slider for brightness and boost that up a bit. When you make these changes, because it's all AI driven, there is a slight delay, and how long you wait, that depends on the speed of your computer. But you can see that, there you go, it's brightened that up. And because the software is doing all of that heavy lifting for you, I think it's well worth the wait. There's a couple of other tools inside of Luminar AI that are just really useful to play around with. You can apply a lookup table to your photo to help with the color grading. For example, we could go for Anaheim or Long Beach. Any of these moods may enhance the photo to give it a look you're after. So here was our before, here was our after, a little bit more pop and contrast again. And there's other interesting tools to play around with as well, such as mystical, which sounds like something you probably wouldn't really want to be applying to architecture. And if you push it to 100, you think absolutely no way. But you know what? Sometimes I push just a little bit of this into my files, and I find it just takes the edge off some of those hard lines that the clarity and structure created. We get the best of both worlds, some really strong punchy lines in the architecture, while just having a barely noticeable subtle softness to it. So I'll show you the before and the after. There's just a really slight softness to that. So let's zoom out and have a quick look at our before, and this was our Lightroom edit. Nothing essentially wrong with this edit, but this is our Luminar edit, and we've just been able to take things just that little bit further with the application of Luminar. So if you want to stop with your edits inside of Lightroom and do something like this on the left hand side, or you want to take things just that little bit further, well, if you're serious about your photography and you want to make an impact with your work and get your clients to take notice of you, then I would absolutely recommend investing in a tool such as Luminar AI. Right, to get this back into Lightroom, all we need to do is click apply. Luminar is going to run some calculations while it exports it, and it's going to send the edited TIFF back into Lightroom for us. So while we look at our before and our after comparisons, please bear in mind, if you're trying to build a portfolio of your own work, there is nothing to stop you just going out there, finding some really interesting buildings, photographing them and editing them to the best of your abilities. And before you know it, people are going to be paying you to do the thing that you love. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video, and I'll see you in the next video. And please don't forget, architectural photographers out there, those interested in that subject, go ahead and subscribe to my brand new channel dedicated to architectural photography. I'll see you there on that channel. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye for now.